Final segment of the show for today. We're talking to Mr. Matthew Walker, Jr., and of course the topic is the Freedom Rides, and Mr. Walker himself was a participant in the Freedom Rides in 1961. And of course, Mr. Walker, you were talking about that your voyage on the bus itself. Let's pick up at that point.
Okay, we had left Montgomery, we had passed into Mississippi, and as I said, the bus was doing about 95 miles an hour when it came across the Alabama-Mississippi border. Shortly after we got into Mississippi, the bus stopped and was boarded by a good number of soldiers. I think they may have been National Guardsmen. And so the bus had experienced, the Freedom Ride had experienced, as we all know, quite a bit of violence in Alabama. And we've later learned that the Attorney General had talked to the governors of these states and had discouraged them as far as allowing violence. So I believe that's the reason they had these armed soldiers board the bus. They stood in the aisle all the way to Jackson. It was a very exciting ride. I do remember as we proceeded, looking out the window, counting, and I'll never forget, I counted, I think it was 26 state trooper cars riding behind us, and a helicopter continuously circling overhead. We would pass little towns, and there would be whites standing on the side of the road, jeering, yelling very unpleasant things at us, but we were fortunate to have avoided any violence all the way to Jackson. When we got to Jackson, we walked into the bus station, and as soon as we walked into the bus station, we were escorted to the waiting paddy wagons from the Jackson police. We were immediately arrested and put in jail there in Hinds County Jail, and the Freedom Riders kept on coming. As a matter of fact, the Jackson newspaper had a little box on the front page where every day they would give the number of riders arrested. So this was a continuing thing. We filled up the Hinds County Jail, and after we'd been there maybe a week or two, they shipped us out to Parchman Penitentiary. Parchman was notorious for its unsavory atmosphere, and we knew that when we got to Parchman that things would be more difficult. Our introduction began with, of course, a strip search. You had to take a shower, then you were interrogated. And the interrogation was such that you were sat in a chair surrounded by police, and if you answered without saying sir, you were immediately struck across the head with a billy club. Some of the riders were beaten up pretty badly at this stage, simply because they failed to say yes sir or no sir. We were dealt with rather harshly by the guards while we were in jail, and as a matter of fact, things got to the point where the lawyers complained to the Justice Department, and they finally, I think we may have been there for several weeks. I mean, we're talking 40+ years ago, and my memory's not perfect, over 40 years. But I think we stayed at Parchman for several weeks, and we were finally released, rode back to Nashville on the train. One or two things that I do remember about the Hinds County Jail and the trip into Jackson, which I feel I should mention, is that on the way, once we got into the city of Jackson, of course, with the big police escort and so forth, everybody knew this was a bus full of Freedom Riders. The reaction of the whites was hostility. They would yell things and so forth. And the black people were so happy to see us. You could see them waving, and some of them were actually crying because they were just so moved that somebody would come down there and try to do something about the situation. While we were in jail to protest being arrested, we did go on a hunger strike right there in Hinds County, and the locals would send us just about every day care packages with candy bars, cigarettes, and so forth. And since we were on a hunger strike, we didn't eat anything. We just drank water, but several of us started smoking simply because the cigarettes helped kill the pain of hunger. The conditions in Mississippi were very oppressive at the time. I do remember one radio announcer making mention of